Pagurus miamensis, Provenzano 1959, family Paguridae. The behavioral differences between Diogenid and Pagurid crabs prove to be rather extensive and consistent. Although the two families possess the same classes of behavior, a number of differences between them became apparent during this study. These differences will be described in more detail under Pagurus miamensis. The other species of Pagurus and Pilopagurus studied showed only minor variations of the family theme. Pagurus miamensis is a small, active species which is widespread around Curaçao, although previously unreported from the island. It is a black and white crab, averaging about 3 millimeters in cephalothorax length. As is characteristic of the genus, miamensis has unequal chelipeds, the right being distinctly larger. This species is being considered first among the Pagurid species because of the relatively greater amount of work done with it. Pagurus miamensis was present in many shallow water locations around Curaçao. Although not as narrowly restricted as Clibinarius tricolor, it was only occasionally found below 2 meters and was most abundant in about 1 meter of water. It is limited to waters with good circulation and a rocky or reef-covered bottom. Crabs were often found near various types of sessile coelenterate. No specimens were found in the north coast bocas, where the wave action is considerable. It was common in the open waters outside Piscadera Bay, St. Cruis Bay, Boca St. Michel, Versen Bay, St. Martha Bay, parts of Spance Water, and Folk Bay. Pagurus miamensis is a nocturnal species, with a dial pattern of movement somewhat similar to that of Clibinarius tricolor. In most places, aggregations are present during the day. These aggregations are smaller and never as dense as those of tricolor. They may contain up to 100 individuals in an area of about 120 square centimeters. But even in the most dense group, crabs are not piled up on top of one another. As will be shown later, these crabs appear to orient to the particular rocks they gather on, rather than the presence of conspecific individuals, as in tricolor. During most of the day, individuals are relatively inactive and withdrawn into their shells. They do not move about or feed to any degree. Around 1500 hours, the crabs begin to move about and away from the area of aggregation. Concomitant with the increase in locomotor activity, the crabs begin feeding activity, picking at detritus matter with both chelipeds. During the evening and night, the crabs move up to several meters away from their aggregation area. At some time in the early morning, they begin to move back toward their aggregation area. By 0430 hours, many are in the diurnal area, and by 500 hours, the aggregation is formed, and the crabs are beginning to become inactive. Thus, Pagurus miamensis moves out to feed about 1.5 hours before Clibinarius tricolor moves out and returns to its aggregation area 3/4 to 1 hour before that species aggregates. 2 aggregations of Pagurus miamensis were marked and daily counts made for several days. The two groups were about 1.5 meters apart, partially beneath a submerged iron girder in about 40 centimeters of water. The larger group contained 186 individuals, was located 6 meters from shore, and was marked with blue ink. The other group contained 60 crabs, was 4.5 meters from shore, and was marked with black ink. Both were marked and replaced in their respective areas on March 18. The number of marked crabs counted on later days is shown in the table below. It is felt that the large initial decrease in numbers is due more to loss of markings than movement of crabs. In a second marking experiment, a group of crabs that diurnally aggregated on a medium-sized rock in about 60 centimeters of water was chosen. Of the 177 Pagurus miamensis in the group, 75 were marked and placed back on the rock on July 2nd. The table below shows the number of marked crabs found on the rock and in the nearby area, 3 meters in all directions, on subsequent days. These observations indicate the presence of rather stable group composition and location in Pagurus miamensis. In a third pilot experiment concerned with the characteristics of aggregations in the field, 2 rocks were observed for several days. These rocks were inhabited diurnally by 5 and 10 individuals of Pagurus miamensis respectively. The number and position of crabs on these rocks had been constant for 3 days prior to alternation. The rocks were then moved 10 centimeters closer to shore after the crabs had left for the evening. The next 2 days the rocks were inhabited by the same number of crabs on the same parts of these rocks. As indicated by the above tests and by laboratory experiments described in a later section, it appears that miamensis orients to physical factors of its diurnal aggregation, rather than the presence of conspecific individuals. The results of field and laboratory distribution measurements are presented in Table 5. As can be seen, miamensis's field distributions are strongly contagious. The laboratory measurements were all made in small glass aquaria. As with Clibonarius tricolor, dense aggregations were not formed under the more uniform conditions presented in the laboratory. However, the diurnal distributions were contagious. As would be expected, the distribution was random at night. As shown above, Pagurus miamensis is an active species that tends to aggregate. Many social contacts are made without the execution of any aggressive displays. Before the aggressive signals are described, a behavior should be discussed which was not clearly observed in the Diogenid crabs studied, but was often seen in miamensis and all Pagurid crabs observed. I have called these movements dislodging shaking. They are executed by one crab when another crawls onto the back of its shell. The crab being crawled upon rises slightly on its ambulatories, and with its walking legs stationary, moves its body shell back and forth quickly around an axis perpendicular to and through the plane of its own shell aperture. This short swinging motion, about 30 degrees movement, sometimes physically throws the other crab off. Other times the rate of movement of the offending crab increases markedly after dislodging shaking. An individual does not always show this behavior pattern when another crab crawls over it, and it is not as noticeable in Pagurus miamensis as in some other species. A series of experiments concerning one of the factors of stimulation of this pattern will be described in a later section. The ambulatory raise of Pagurus miamensis is an upward movement of the limb through only 30 degrees, to a position about 25 degrees below the horizontal. In the fully raised attitude, the limb is not straight, but rather the dactyl is inclined downward slightly. The crab may raise both ambulatories simultaneously and may hold the limbs in the raised posture for several seconds. In addition to this stereotyped display, interacting crabs occasionally strike at each other with an upward then forward down movement of an ambulatory. This pattern was only rarely seen. Movements of the chelipeds were not as frequent as those of the ambulatories, but appeared to be more important in aggressive interactions. In 1,050 interactions, 331 cheliped extensions and 189 cheliped presentations occurred, as compared with 696 raises. The crab may bring its chelipeds forward, as it raises its body slightly, to a position in which the dactyls is at an angle of about 85 to 80 degrees with the substratum. The position of the dactyl is a bit further forward in the cheliped presentation position of Diogenid crabs. The motion takes only about 0.18 seconds. Because Pagurid crabs generally carry their cheliped dactyls, particularly the major, doubled back under the mouth region, the movement to the presentation position moves the dactyl through 45 to 60 degrees. The cheliped extension is also a rather rapid motion of one or both limbs. The minor cheliped is moved forward and upward to a position just below the horizontal. The major cheliped is moved through 115 degrees to a position about 20 degrees below the horizontal. The dactyl of the major cheliped is slightly open as the appendage is moved and held in the extended position. Occasionally, the movements of a double cheliped extension are combined with a rapid forward movement of the whole body. The movement of the body appears to intensify or emphasize the motion of the chelipeds. On just one occasion, a peculiar sequence of behavior was observed. Two large individuals had moved to within 6 millimeters of each other and were facing one another directly. They exchanged double cheliped extensions and a series of double ambulatory raises. Both were holding their chelipeds in the extension position when they began bowing to each other. With the chelipeds extended, first one crab and then the other would come partially out of its shell, move its body slightly down and forward, and then pull back into its shell to the normal position. The two crabs bowed to each other about 5 times, then both moved back, turned, and moved away. The significance of this dignified exchange is unknown. Shell fighting in Pagurid crabs includes a behavior pattern not seen in Diogenid crabs. Also, there is somewhat less positioning behavior at the beginning of an interaction. In Pagurid crabs such as Pagurus miamensis, the opposed position during shell-fighting behavior is slightly different from that of the Diogenid crabs. The apertures of the combatants are not over one another. The shell of the aggressor barely overlaps the edge of the shell of the defender when viewed from the side. In this offset opposed position, the attacker goes through the aggressive sequence. This includes 2 main elements of behavior: wrapping movements and spasmodic shaking. Spasmodic shaking is a series of 4 to 6 cycles of short movements, about 1 millimeter. The shell of the defending crab is moved back and forth along an axis parallel to the substratum and the body axis of the attacker, and perpendicular to the columella axis of the crab being shaken. The movement is brought about by a to and fro motion of the aggressor's ambulatories. The chelipeds of the attacker are stationary, resting either just in the aperture of the defending crab or on the rim of the shell hole. The movement can also be affected by a motion of the aggressor's whole cephalothorax, everything moving except the aggressor's shell. A series of spasmodic shaking movements lasts less than a second. Following or between series of spasmodic shaking, the attacker may go through positioning behavior. It moves the defending crab back and forth, about 30 degrees movement, around an axis perpendicular to and through the plane of the shell aperture. Intermixed with this movement is a shifting from the left to the right ambulatories by the attacking crab. This side-to-side movement is similar to the positioning of many Diogenid crabs, but without any noticeable vertical motion. After this, additional series of spasmodic shaking or rapping may occur. Rapping movements are similar to those of Clibinarius tricolor, although rarely moving over half the length of the cephalothorax, and appear to be slow, about 0.75 seconds per cycle. The rapping motions are affected by two distinct types of movements. The usual rap, as described for Diogenids, a second manner or rapping which is an exaggerated shaking movement. The motion is similar in the two cases, but the attacker's shell is moved in the former case and the defender's shell in the latter. Short raps may give way to spasmodic shaking without any interruption. In a successful fight, as the defender starts to come out, he or she can be seen to tap at the mouth area of the winner with its chelipeds. Spasmodic shaking almost invariably precedes evacuation. If the aggressor is rapping as the loser starts to come out, the former moves back into the offset opposed position and performs spasmodic shaking. Some shell fights are carried to completion without any rapping movements. There is usually no contact at all between crabs as the loser vacates its shell. The sexual behavior of Pagurus miamensis includes a type of behavior pattern not seen among the Diogenid crabs. After contacting a female which is about to or has recently molted, the male turns her over into an opposed position and carries out some short rocking movements similar to the gentle rocking of Clibinarius tricolor. Accompanying these movements, he places his chelipeds into the female aperture. He may then perform no more overt behaviors, but either holds the female quietly in his ambulatories, or, more frequently, he grasps the rim of her shell aperture with either, usually major, cheliped. He may maintain this position for several hours, during which time he moves about quite readily, dragging the female after him. After some minutes or hours, he may again start to rock the shell of the female and investigate the female shell aperture. He continues rocking and moving his chelipeds about in the aperture until he secures one of the female's appendages with one of his chelipeds. Although almost all combinations of limb grasp and cheliped grasping have been observed, the most frequent arrangement was the major cheliped, holding the first left ambulatory of the female by the propodal segment. After the male has attained this position, the major element of precopulatory behavior begins. The male jerks the female toward him by short, rapid movements of his cheliped. These back and forth movements over a distance about equal to the length of the eye stalks. The inward motion, pulling the female toward the male, takes 0.06 seconds or less, and the female is held in for about 0.80 seconds, then pushed back in about 0.12 seconds. These short jerks are carried out in series of 2 to 6 cycles. During these movements, the female is in a normal, upright position. The male may drag the female about over the bottom while holding onto her appendage. After some minutes to hours of this jerking behavior, the male turns the female over either completely onto her back or to a position in which the plane of her shell aperture is vertical. He continues jerking and occasionally rocking the female gently for a short time. The female eventually comes up and moves her minor cheliped about in the area of the male eye stalks. The male often then releases the appendage of the female as he eases forward, although he may hold on, doubling back the dactyl of the cheliped concerned as he gets into position. The copulatory position is as in other species, and the 5th periopods of the male can be seen moving back and forth between the genital orifices. In 8 cases, copulation lasted 3 to 4 seconds, and in a single case, it lasted 24 seconds. Occasionally, just after copulation, a female moved her body in and out of her shell rapidly, as if wrapping by herself. After copulation, the male often pushes the female away without any further behaviors. Sometimes the male does carry out some jerking, while holding onto either an appendage or the rim of the aperture, and rotating movements for a few minutes. When the female is released by the male, she usually has a soft exoskeleton from her recent molt, and may have some eggs in place on her pleopods. The new eggs are rapidly brought out and attached to the pleopods. 2 females had some eggs in place only 2 minutes after copulation. In one case, spermatophore filaments were present not only on her ventral surface, but also among the new egg masses. In another instance, a large number of new eggs were in place 15 minutes after copulation, 10 minutes after being released by the male. One pair was observed to mate and copulate before the female had molted or released her old larvae. In mated pairs, the male was 0 to 60% larger in cephalothorax length than the female, average 30%. Collections and measurement of egg diameters were carried out as in C. tricolor. The results are shown in Figure 21. The results offer little or no support for the existence of a simple lunar cycle. The diel variation in locomotor activity and feeding behavior measured in the laboratory is shown in Figure 22. The afternoon observations were carried out 1/2 hour earlier than in the other species. However, the 1700 to 1730 and 1730 to 1800 hours periods may have been too late to catch any increase in movement associated with the afternoon immigration. Figure 21. Variation in average egg diameter in Pagurus miamensis during May 1964. Figure 22. Diel variation in activities of Pagurus miamensis, all activities generally nocturnal.